It is election time here in Ontario, and that's what we're doing. We're talking election. I'm here with Daniel, and what we're going to do is we're going to look at a bunch of different issues. We're going to be talking about conscience protection, family law, education, healthcare, long-term care, COVID issues. We're going to try to hit on a lot of those issues really quick. But before we get into that, any quick thoughts, opening thoughts? We're just heading into the election. What are you thinking, Daniel?
Yeah, it's a really short election period, just over a month, where the candidates will be out campaigning and doing various events. It's going to be interesting, the fact that it is so short. There's not as much time to get some of these issues out there. If your candidates are not talking about these issues, there's not as much opportunity to get them talking about it. And that's part of where something like an all candidates debate also comes in, where the citizens of that riding can ask questions about these issues.
Well, that's true. And I also think it's just going to be really an interesting election, given the fact that we've got a PC party coming out of their first mandate. We'd be remiss if we didn't mention that there's some turmoil around that. We have two other right parties that have come out of things, each of them having a current MPP, current sitting MPP that was voted in as a PC party member for both the Ontario Party with Rick Nichols there and Belinda Karahalios in the New Blue Party, and they both come out of the PC party. You've got Andrea Horwath. Could this be her last election as the leader of the NDP party? And you've got Stephen Del Duca. He's a somewhat unknown, and yet he's been around the block for a long time, a former cabinet minister with the Wynne government. So he's introducing himself to Ontarians for the first time, and you've got Doug Ford, who's been the premier for the last 4 years. So it's just going to be really interesting to see how this goes. Again, you mentioned the speed and it's probably the shortest election period that can happen, down to 4 weeks plus a day. So yeah, it's just going to be really interesting to see where things shake out. But I think what we want to do and how we want to help our supporters is, like you mentioned, what are the issues? How can we arm people with information on the issues, questions that maybe that they could ask, so that they can get clarity on the issues, so that come June 2nd, they know who to vote for.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and of course, all the parties are vying for votes right now. You have some of the media headlines I saw are talking about, is this election a referendum on Doug Ford? Did people like Doug Ford over the past 4 years? So that's some of the questions. Otherwise, like you said, Stephen Del Duca is not well known, the leader of the Liberal Party, but he's trying to rebuild the party from 7 seats after the last election. Right. So they don't have the same number of existing MPPs as even the NDP do. So trying to rebuild the party. So who's going to form government? Who's going to be official opposition? Traditionally, we're kind of used to the PCs and the Liberals being the first and second or vice versa parties in Ontario. But right now, the NDP is the opposition. Yeah. So what's that going to look like after this election?
Be interesting for sure. So let's kind of get into the first issue there. Yeah, Daniel, talk about freedom of conscience. Why is it important? And what are some things that people can do? People can ask about it.
Yeah, so this is obviously one of the issues that we've been focusing on in Ontario. ARPA had the policy report that was produced last year on this issue specifically. And as a little bit of background on the issue, it was it's been an issue, especially since the legalization of euthanasia in 2016. And then you have in Ontario, the regulatory college is forcing doctors to provide an effective referral if they have a conscientious objection. So they have to at least connect the patient with a doctor who will be able to end their life. And what we really want to advocate for is for legislation that says you may not coerce a doctor to go against their conscience on the issue of euthanasia and also more broadly, but euthanasia is definitely the most palatable one to a lot of people right now.
So this was a bit of an election issue last election, right? And the Conservatives, the PC party, they did have a stance that they did support legislation. But I mean, obviously a lot's happened since that election and now, and there's been a lot of their priorities got sidetracked with COVID. But really not a lot of the main parties are really talking about this right now. And so we want to encourage you to ask that question of, we want to encourage our supporters, ask the question of candidates, like, will you and do you support conscience protection, especially for healthcare professionals, to not have to provide an effective referral? And we're really hoping that these questions getting asked, this becomes an election issue again. Some of the other parties, some of the newer parties, this election brings two new parties to the fore. The Ontario Party, it's not a brand new party, but it's a little bit more recognized and well known, especially amongst ARPA supporters for this election. And the New Blue Party, the Ontario Party specifically, does have a policy around it where they would oppose any kind of requirement on healthcare professionals to participate in things like effective referrals. The other main parties, the Conservatives, the Greens, the Liberals, and the NDP, they don't seem to be talking about it. So that's why we want to encourage people to ask a question on this issue. Do you support conscience protection for especially healthcare professionals?
Yeah, and it's definitely interesting having a little bit of a different political landscape in this election, because before the election was called, there were two sitting MPPs, one from each of those parties, who had the opportunity to bring up some more of these kind of issues. So they may have more opportunity throughout this election period to be able to bring up those issues as well, even if the other parties are not as interested in talking about them.
Right, and then the opportunity is because they're bringing it up, then the other parties are required to talk about some of these issues as well. So another real big issue for us that we want to talk about, we want to encourage you to talk about because it matters, is issues around family law. Mm-hmm. And so with our previous government prior to the current progressive conservative government that's in right now, or is just, I guess, finishing up that first term right now, the Liberal government brought in a lot of very progressive policies, progressive issues. I'm thinking specifically of the All Families Are Equal Act that made some really big changes to family law here in Ontario. And so that's another area where the main parties aren't really talking about these issues too much. And we want to really encourage people to start asking questions so that maybe these issues, you can find out, if not how the party stands on issues, you can at least learn where your own personal candidate stands on these issues, and that can help you make an informed decision there. So why don't you talk about some of the issues around family law that we've been discussing here?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so this is definitely an issue that hasn't really been discussed since that bill was passed in 2016, so just over 6 years ago now. And it's one of those issues that we're trying to bring back into the discussion through discussions with MPPs and through their MPP's own constituents reaching out to them on the issue. So we did put out an article last week just kind of explaining the issue. So we'll post a link to that with this video as well. But there's kind of four main issues that we're focusing on, which the All Families Are Equal Act brought into play. So it did a number of things, one of which was removing the terms mother and father from all of Ontario law. So legally, you cannot be a mother or a father in Ontario anymore. And then they had opportunities for agreements between adults, up to 4 adults who could choose to be parents of a child, and none of them had to be biologically related to that child. So disconnecting the idea of being a parent from biological children. So there's a number of recommendations we have around that. And you can ask your candidates questions about that as well, just to see, is there anything you will do to, whether it's put mother and father back into the law, or whether it's connecting parentage at least a little bit more with biology, and ultimately for the protection and for the well-being of children.
Yes, and one of the things we talked about a little bit is how if you're not a biological parent and you want to adopt a child, you have all these safeguards in place that you need to go through to protect the child to do that. But that doesn't happen when you make one of these parentage agreements. And so you can have people that are obviously not biological parents, but they don't have to go through the same hoops as, say, an adoptive parent might have to go through. And so just we're trying to start the conversation about how do we protect children in these scenarios, and then also back to the first comment, how do we get back to some of the language that's just part of life, part of how life is, God's good design for life. We have mothers, we have fathers. Why don't we use those terms again? And so again, check out the guide. It has some questions you can ask of your candidates. Most of the parties aren't really talking about them, but then we have an opportunity while they're knocking on your door to make these issues things that you can get them to talk about.
It's also something that we want to focus on. Both of these issues, conscience and family, are things that we want to focus on with whoever forms the next government. Any party that forms the next government will have the ability to do some work on each of these issues. And we want to use this opportunity with a new government mandate to say, hey, you now have the opportunity to actually make good changes. And then if they have been hearing this on the campaign trail and they have been hearing this from their constituents, then they will be more likely to actually want to do something about it.
Right. So we'd be remiss if we wouldn't, recognize the reality that COVID has dominated the political scene, especially, provincially in the last 2 years. Well, obviously across the country as well, but provincially it's dominated the conversation. And so, healthcare, long-term care, those are going to be big issues discussed over the course of the election. They're going to be big promises made. I think everybody recognizes there's holes in our healthcare system. There's holes in long-term care. That's where most deaths from COVID-19 occurred. And so, any thoughts on where some of the parties stand on these issues, and what are some of the things that people can ask as it pertains to, say, healthcare? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, there's definitely the kind of typical response to questions about what politicians are going to do about healthcare tends to focus on infrastructure, investments, those kind of things.
How many hospitals and all that stuff.
Yeah, which are important things and useful things, expanding capacity in the hospital system, all of that, which is very important, and we don't want to minimize the importance of that.
Yep.
But it is interesting some of the other issues that parties will focus on. So one of the issues we see is with gender dysphoria and youth who want to undergo gender transition surgeries or take medications for that, all of those issues. And a couple of the parties are trying to focus on expanding access to that. So expanding OHIP coverage for gender transition surgeries, for supporting youth who are struggling with their gender identity. And alternatively, so that would be primarily the NDP and the Liberal that are parties that are focusing on this issue a little bit more. Alternatively, you have the Ontario Party who would ban those procedures for youth in Ontario. So there may be a bit of a clash there on that issue as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And then as far as long-term care, right? Long-term care is obviously a big issue that we need to look at and we need to address. But I think, again, a lot of the parties are focused on the infrastructure around it as well. And so many of them aren't talking about, the parts that make care real care. Mm-hmm. I'm thinking specifically about, we faced a time where so many family members were unable to visit with other family members while they're in long-term care facilities. And I think specifically of an NDP private members bill called the More Than a Visitor Act. And so, when it comes to somebody knocking on your door and talking to you about issues of long-term care, maybe encourage them and ask them, how are you going to make sure families get to see and get to visit with their loved ones in long-term care settings? Because, it was wrong when family members were kept from their loved ones in long-term care facilities. And we need to find ways to ensure that can continue to happen because families are much more than just visitors. And as that bill suggested, that was a great bill put forward by I believe it was MPP Lisa Gretzky of the NDP party, but also recognizing the need to maintain facilities that are culturally and spiritually diverse, and making sure that people can be in homes that match up their cultures, match with their own spiritual needs as well. And actually, most of the parties agree that when it comes to long-term care, when it comes to end of care, elder care help, we need to first make sure people can stay in their homes longer. Second, the homes that they're in, they need to be culturally sensitive and spiritually sensitive to the cares and the needs that person might have.
When we talk about provincial issues as opposed to federal or municipal issues, generally the two biggest issues are healthcare and education. So what are some of the policy proposals around education in Ontario right now?
Yeah, you see, again, there seems to be a little bit of a bent, especially from I'll say a couple of the parties, the Liberal and the NDP talk a lot about infrastructure again. More schools, smaller class sizes, which mean more schools. And I'm talking buildings, brick and mortar buildings. But all of them are talking also about education itself. And so, for example, one of the things that we did see within this last term was the PC party. They made some edits or changes to the sex and physical health curriculum. If some Ontarians would remember, the Wynne government brought in a fairly radical sex ed curriculum, and I think where this current government's curriculum ended up, we wouldn't necessarily be happy with it, completely happy with it. But one thing came out loud and clear, actually, in that process was they listened to parents. There was a massive parental engagement initiative to hear from the most parents possible on the issue, and then you're also hearing a lot of language around that from the PC as well as the New Blue and the Ontario Party about respecting parents' decisions in education as well, and I would say it's somewhat concerning in the Liberal and NDP platforms. You're not reading a whole lot of talk about parental involvement, parental engagement. And so that is somewhat concerning to not see that in their policies. We recently, I think it was last year, ARPA Canada released a policy report on educational diversity. And the first recommendation we have really focuses on ensuring that there's parental choice in education. And so that's something that I would really encourage people to ask the question, where do you stand as a candidate on the issue of, who's the primary educators of children? Is it the state or is it parents? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and just a note while I'm thinking about it, when we talk about the platforms of the parties in this election guide, we will be trying to update it consistently, because only the NDP is really the only party right now that has a full platform out. There's a number of different policy proposals from every party, but they will be giving more policy proposals as they go through the election campaign as well. The one other thing I wanted to ask you about in terms of education is we heard from a lot of ARPA supporters about Bill 67 in Ontario, and there was a lot of concern and a lot of valid concern around that bill. So was that tied into party promises, tied into any platforms?
Yeah, definitely. Like you just noted, the NDP has a pretty robust platform on their website, and they definitely allude to elements that were included in Bill 67. And that Bill 67 really focused on equity in education and talked about things like anti-racism and equity. And I did hear from many ARPA supporters about their concern for that piece of legislation. And without getting into too much detail, just because it probably takes too much to do it in a video like this, I do have we do have online an article on Bill 67, and we'll give you a link to that in the comments or to go along with the video. But essentially, what it boils down to is there's some thinking about critical race theory in that bill. There's a lot of what's called critical race theory in that bill that is concerning, because what it does is it boils everything down to race. And while we do very much have to deal with the realities of racism in our culture, in our lives, there is sin in our lives. And where there is sin, there is racism, and that needs to be recognized. It needs to be repented of. But we can't boil everything down to race either, and tell children that they can only succeed if they're helped, or they're holding people back strictly because they're white. On the other hand, so there is some concerning elements, and we definitely see those elements make their way into some of the policy proposals of the parties as well. So yeah, again, I would encourage people to ask the questions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so we have two more issues on the election guide. We won't go too in depth into them for the sake of time. One of them being freedom of expression and hate speech. It's been an issue that we've seen at the federal level as well. Some talk about various government bills about hate speech online, or how to deal with hate speech more on the criminal level. So there is some talk provincially as well about how to deal with police enforcement of the various provincially regulated issues involved with hate speech. And then the final issue is just the idea that COVID-19 vaccine mandates, everything involved with that. Are the parties saying anything about what they'll be doing in the future? Is there anything noteworthy about that just in the past couple of years?
Yeah, there is a bunch of talk around the issue of going back to hate speech and hate speech type of legislation. A number of the parties, specifically the Liberal and the NDP, they note the Our London Families Act. Can you just build on that a little bit, the Our London Families Act as it pertains to this?
Yeah. The Our London Family Act is a piece of anti-hate speech legislation, right. Essentially. It deals with the family in London, Ontario, which was run over by a van. A horrific incident, which ought to be recognized as it is, as a horrific incident. The parties, some of the parties were very quick to act on legislation to do with that, very much around police enforcement, around issues to do with the Human Rights Code and racism and hate involved with that. The interesting thing being there that the specific incident they're talking about was very much an illegal act already. So it's difficult to broaden the scope of what anti-hate speech legislation and enforcement looks like when it was already an illegal act and a criminal act.
And what it could actually accomplish, or how more legislation could have prevented it when it was already very clearly an evil, crime that could be prosecuted. Mm-hmm. And I think some of the concerns are not that we are not, you wouldn't be opposed to hate speech. It's just who decides what's hate speech, mm-hmm. and what qualifies for hate speech. And I think that's where there is some valid and legitimate concern that needs to be addressed and needs to be expressed. And then, finally, I guess, we would be remiss if we didn't, touch on, at least address the issue of things like, COVID-19 response, and specifically the policy around vaccine mandates or proof of vaccination policies. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that I found interesting is, again, on the NDP's platform, they actually have a plan to conduct some sort of investigation around, okay, how did we respond to COVID-19? So there's a policy proposal to do an inquiry into it, looking into things to really dig into our response, which I think could be good if done well. Mm-hmm. But then the flip side is are we going to look at policies like the coercive proof of vaccination policies that we saw that were brought forward by the government, supported by the Liberals and the NDP. In fact, I think that they, in many ways, they wanted more stringent policies around that as well. And so what do we do with what we discover? So it would be interesting to see. I'm sure there will be inquiries done, but they're the only party that the NDP is the only party that has a stated goal of having one.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that's the 7 issues in the election guide, and of course, it's prepared as a bit of a comparison between what the different parties are saying or have said about these issues. So you have the government, which is the Progressive Conservative Party. You have the opposition, the NDP, Liberal, Green Party, and then the New Blue Party and the Ontario Party. And they're all. It's a bit of a comparison about what each one is saying. So take a look at that. Let us know what you think, or if you have any questions or comments about that as well.
Yeah, if we have any holes and places you want us to fill in, like Daniel said earlier, we do hope to. We want to fill in more as the weeks go on. This is just a really first quick run at it to give people information as the election kicks off. But moving forward from here, encourage you to use it. Encourage you to work with it. Ask the questions. Go to an all candidates debate. Raise your hand and see if you can ask questions there so that all candidates have to answer. If you don't see an all candidates debate happening, I don't know, maybe look at organizing one yourself. But at rock bottom, I just encourage everyone, engage in the issues, understand what's going on, understand where your candidate stands, and then obviously be sure to vote. There's going to be more advanced polls at this with this election than typical, and there's opportunities for mail-in voting. But failing those two, make sure you get out June 2nd and vote.